Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting, the AAA. So tonight we're going to talk about how to authenticate, authorize, and keep an account of when a user comes in. So let's get started immediately. And so in this chapter, we'll cover, I think it's a pretty quick chapter, should be pretty easy, pretty straightforward. All right, so make sure you take out your notes. No packet tracer, we're not going to do that. We'll do that in class. All right, so authentication. What the authentication with the AAA? We all know that Telnet is vulnerable to brute force. Brute force is somebody's trying to guess what your password is. So they'll keep guessing till they get it. That's one of the reasons why we only give it 3 chances to do it, and then you get knocked out. The reason you interrupt the brute force by only allowing 3 failed, and then you have to type in, try to re-log in again. But also, not only Telnet is vulnerable to brute force, but it's also vulnerable to eavesdropping. If anybody has a protocol analyzer, they'll be very easily to capture the clear text password that you are typing when you are trying to log into your router. So what you want to do is SSH. SSH allows that encrypted password to be passed to the router when you try to log in. And as you remember from last week, the way to set up SSH is you got to create a domain name, create the crypto key. In this case, we're using RSA and the modules of 2048. That's a huge key. And we're going to create a username and a password. In this case, the username admin is going to use the script algorithm to create the strong password. And then you go to line VTY from 0 to 4 and make sure you're only transporting only the SSH, which means now you can't have telnets. No one will be able to telnet. And login local, you're telling the router that when the user type in their username and the username admin and the secret password, they'll be authenticated locally on the server because that's where the information is. Okay, so that we did last week. Excuse me. Now we have to have a little more, excuse me, choking. And now we have to have a little bit more flexibility and more detailed information about authentication. We'll use authentication, and after we authenticate the users, we're going to do, we're going to authorize them. So if so, let somebody send me their username and password, and I validate them. That's authenticating. Make sure that they have typed in the username and password correctly. Then I need to authorize them. Authorize them means, all right, what resources does the user have access to after after he has been authenticated? I give him a specific amount of memory to use, specific resources to access, and so on. That's after it has been authorized, or maybe a server that he needs to connect to. And then I have to take accounting, keeping track of what resources he has accessed the whole time that person has logged in. I keep track of what did he do, what resources, what servers that he has access to, and I keep track of it. That's what the really is. You authenticate the user. After you authenticate them, you authorize them to have access to certain resources, and accounting means you keeping track of what that person have access. So here's the first thing that I want you to write: the AAA component, authentication, and describe what authentication is. Authorization and accounting, and describe what these are too as well. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the um, authentication modes. There are 2 different modes that you can authenticate. You can go directly to the router, give your username and password, and then the router will locally look up your username and password, and if they are validated, they'll tell you, okay, you're all good to go. Server-based means you send the information to the router, then the router will ask for the username and password. Once you give it to it, it sends it to a server. The server will authenticate you and then tell the router to either he's been validated or not. All right, we'll take a look at how to set up both local authentication and server-based as well. Authorization, pretty much the same thing. You can go to the server and then the server will authorize you to either or authorize you or not authorize you. Or depending, to be authorized, you have to be authenticated, of course, which means you've been validated with the username and password, and then the server will decide what resources you are authorized to use. Accounting, after you've been authorized to use a specific resource, it's going to keep track of the information of the resource that you use in terms of what network, what connections, the system, the command, the resource, everything. Okay. So let's take a look at the command line for authentication access locally in this case. Here's what I want you to do. How do you set up an authentication locally? The first thing I want you to type in these. Well, you know what? The best thing to do is to type in the command right here, and we'll explain each one of them. The first one is pretty straightforward. You created two usernames, junior admin and admin, and you're using the script algorithm for the secret passwords. Okay, so I want you to write these commands. And then you enable the AAA new model, okay? And then you say AAA authentication login. So the first thing, there's three words or commands. AAA authentication login means that you are going to use a username and a password for the console port, auxiliary port, and the telnet ports. That's what you're allowing login. That's what the default is. So AAA authentication login allows login for the three ports, and the default means for all three ports, console, auxiliary, and telnet. Local case means that you have to type in the username and the password if they are in capital, lowercase letters, or are case sensitive. All right, that's all that this says. All right, now you can get into a little bit more. Add the word enable, so put that in your notes. So after you saying that you want you are able to log in through the console, auxiliary, and telnet ports or SSH ports, and they are case sensitive. If you don't know what the password is for your junior admin or admin, then you can use the enable password. That's what the enable is here for, to allow you in, to allow you to get you in. Now, if you wrote the last three commands, the AAA authentication login, SSH login lowercase, then you go to line VTY04 authentication SSH. What these three commands, three lines is saying is, okay, this first one right here, the default local case enable, that's only going to be used for auxiliary and the console port. But for SSH, for the remote access, we want you to use um, a named access list. First of all, you go to SSH named access list. Make sure they are on the list, that they are allowed to as a telnet remote access, and that's local case as well, case sensitive. Then you go to VTY authenticating SSH login, which means SSH is going to use an access list for you to be authenticated, but the auxiliary and console port will still use the junior admin and admin, and enable will be the backup for them. Okay. If you're still not sure, I hope I explained it correct. Pretty straightforward. If you still have any questions, of course, remind me in class. All right. You can also check the authentication, the attempts maximum field, so you can set a maximum of failed attempts when you're doing local authentication. Uh, you can check out the local user logout, how long you've been logged out for. check out the AAA sessions. So all of these commands allow you to troubleshoot and fine tune the authentication configurations that you have. Okay, you can use debug AAA. You can debug any of those. Debugging is like doing the show command, but it gives you a real-time information. So you can debug accounting, you can debug authentication, which means when you type debug AAA authentication, it's immediately going to do the authentication and give you results. And it keeps doing it. You have to make sure you undebug because otherwise you'll be consuming bandwidth every time you do a debug command. But that's for testing purposes. Let's say you want to test to see if the user is able to authenticate if there's any problem with the password or anything like that. So you type debug AAA space authentication, and the user and the router will do authentication and will let you know if there's a failure in the authentication or so on, if you suspect that that's a problem. So here is a typical debug AAA authentication, and so it gives you information. For example, the action is trying to log in, and so on. It will take you step by step. And this way, this person has passed already. As you can see, the status has passed. So the authentication is all good. If you see the word fail down here, then you know the authentication has failed, and that's why that user had no access or was not authorized. Okay, uh, server-based means that you are going to send your information to a server, a secured ACS server, which is a software that Cisco has that you can put on a computer, and it will enable the computer to be either a Radius or a TACACS server, and that's where the authentication and authorization and accounting will actually occur. Okay, so let's try to do that. And but before we do that, needs to know the difference between the Radius and the TACACS server. All right, so I want you to write these notes. This is very important. So make a little table. And I want you to know the difference between TACACS Plus, which is a Cisco-specific proprietary protocol, and the Radius server. So if the functionality is the TACACS always separates the authentication, authorization, and accounting from each other, different channels when they are sending data back and forth between the server. But in the Radius servers, they combine the authentication and authorization on the same channel. So that might be a little bit not as secure as TACACS. Again, the standard is TACACS Plus is Cisco specified protocol. Radius is really open system. Anybody can use it. The information that's being sent back and forth between TACACS and the user, they use the transmission control protocol, which is more control and making sure, it's connection oriented and reliable. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back. But Radius uses UDP, which is connectionless and unreliable, if you remember all of that. This uses CHAP, back and forth, and uses the challenge handshaking protocol where you have to send in your password and you'll be an authenticant and the password is encrypted. And then the TACACS server will also send in their password, be authenticated by a user. Radius doesn't really do that. So it does not, it only uses unidirectional, they only challenge it one time. It does not keeps challenging you with a password, asking you for the password, in other words. Protocol, this is multi-protocol users. This is no ARA, not BOE, but these are really hardly ever used anyway. This can support older protocols. Confidentiality, the whole packet is encrypted. With Radius, only the password that you sent is encrypted. And customizations, you can provide authorization of a router command if you need to. In the accounting part is where Radius has an extensive amount of information that you can have to keep an account after you've been authorized. In TACACS server, there's only a certain amount of information that keeps account of what you have been authorized to use. Okay, so if you're really setting up a Cisco server, probably TACACS is way to go. For dial-ups, you've been using Radius, and Radius has been used extensively outside, almost with every remote authentications servers. So, it stands for Remote Authentication Dial-in User Services, right? All right, so let's see if we can set up. This is just goes through the authentication process, accessing the server itself. So we're going to take a look at a command. This is just goes through the communication process, how to get to the server itself. And the first thing that you need to do is tell the server that you are going to send the information to an ACS server where you're running Windows and the software is running in there. So if you want to do the TACACS server, make sure it's installed in here. You go to the router, enable the new model, type in the command AAA new model, and then you say TACACS server, give it a name, give it the IP address, tell it the IP address of the server is the 1.100, right? See there's a single connection, and give it a password and exit. So once that's set up in here, then anybody that sends in information for authentication will be sent to the 192.168.1.10. All right, so please write this down. This is how you configure AAA TACACS Plus server. Okay. In here on the software, then you can put in the username. You go in here, you type in the username and the password and all that good stuff in here. But that's pretty good. It's a GUI interface, pretty straightforward. Okay. For Radius server, please write this down. This is how you set up a Radius server. Enable the AAA new model. Give it a name called Radius server, server R in this case. And you say the IP address is 1.100. You have to set up the authorization port and the accounting port. In this case, it's 1812 for the authorization port and the accounting port 1813. Give it a password and exit. So this is how you configure a AAA Radius server. All right. And then you have to tell the router to send the authentication information to those servers. So what do? You go in here after you do the configuration, you're going to type in AAA Authentication Login Default. That means all authentications that are being asked for. Anybody that comes in from the console, auxiliary, or the telnet, that's what AAA Authentication Login Default means. Group, you need to use the group, and then you type in the word TACACS Plus. And then after that, you write another word group, then you say radius, which means group TACACS Plus. If you type that first, that means I'm going to send the information to the TACACS Plus server for authentication. If that fails, then you go to the radius. So group TACACS Plus means go there first, and if you don't type anything else, then that's the only server that's available for authentication. If after that you type in group radius, and then that means that would be the backup, the radius server. So that's the command that you want to type all the way at the bottom right here. See it? All right, so please write that command. This is to tell the server, who's going to be the authorizing. In this case, we have group TACACS Plus, and then we have group TACACS Servers as the backup. And local case, again, means that the username and password that you type in are case sensitive. So when you send them, they are going to be sent to the TACACS servers for authentication first. And if the TACACS server is not present for any reason, then again, it will be sent to the radius server. All right, moving on, doing some troubleshooting. You can debug AAA authentication like we said before. Better get the pass. Otherwise, then you got problem either with the username or maybe they're not typing the password. It's case sensitive. They typed in a capital letter instead of a lowercase letter. All right, you can debug the radius server using these commands, or you can debug the TACACS server using these commands. It could be any of the accounting, authentication, authorization, or even the events or the packets in this case. All right, so here are some example of debugging the TACACS server. And by the way, I wanted to just show you. I remember when I took this test, I had one of these debug commands come up, and in fact, you got to look for the pass or fail. You can see that in this case, there's a failure right here on the authentication. The guy did not give the correct password in this case. That's why they will not be able to get in. All right, so let's take a look at authorization and accounting. Pretty straightforward. I think that's even easier. Okay, so please write these down right up here, all of this, because I want to make sure you understand, even though I think we wrote it a little bit. I told you asked to do it in the very beginning, but now it's a little bit more detailed. So authentication ensures the device or end user is legit. Authorization allows or disallows authenticated users access to certain areas and programs on the network, the resources really. All right, and I also want you to write down the difference between the TACACS and the radius server. TACACS Plus separates the authentication and authorization from each other when you are sending information, but the radius does not do that. All right, so let's do the authorization. All you have to do is type in the command authorization on the router. Remember, you have to have your TACACS server or radius servers already been configured on the router, and then you telling the router who's going to do the authorization. So you type uh, authorization. If you go all the way down here, AAA authorization network default. That means all the resources on the network, anything that's been all the resources on the network, use the TACACS server. Or if you type exec default, only the exec commands on the server. So we usually type network default group TACACS server. So all the authorization, anything that's going to be authorized, any of the resources on the network, the TACACS server will take care of that. That's it, believe it or not. Accounting, pretty much the same thing. The only difference here, I want you to type this command for when it comes to the accounting. You type network default start stop. Start stop means that I want you to take accounting after the guy been authorized from the very beginning all the way to the end of the session. Start stop. And ask the TACACS server to do that for you. If you type start only, that means only in the beginning take accounting, not all the way till he finishes, just when they first access. But usually you want accounting for everything, and that takes of course more memory. But start stop means take account of everything, all the resources that they used and that they have accessed after the resources that they've been authorized to. Okay, so that's the commands that you want to write for. That's how you keep account of all the resources that are being used. All right, the 802.1x authentication. This is a pretty important authentication um, utility that you can use on the switch. So when somebody sends information to the switch, the port on the switch, what it's going to do, if you enable the 802.1x on the port will not allow, first of all, it will block all data. All data will be blocked except for information for authentication purposes. So he's only going to allow authentication frames and authorization frames passed to the server. So he's not allowing you to send any data through the port to anybody until you authorize. The switch is doing that, right? So that's why it's port based, which means, okay, I'm going to block all your legitimate data until you're authorized. So it's going to allow you to send authentication and authorization information to the server Once the server tells the switch that you are authorized, then the port opens up and then you'll be able to pass data back and forth. Okay, that's what the 802.1x really does. Uh, so how do you configure it? Okay, type in this command. How do you configure 802.1x? You just you go in and you type in authenticate. You go to interface fast Ethernet 01 and you type authentication port dash control and you just type in space auto, and that will, don't do force authorized, but because that's the default. That means it's open and it's open to pass data, and then without the 802.1x. But if you write auto, it's going to enable the 802.1x port-based authentication, which means it will block data and only allow 802.1x information to go, the EPOL, pass back and forth between you, the supplicant, and the authorization server. Once you are authorized, then the server will authorize the switch to tell the switch, okay, open up the port and let the data go through. All right. So the command is authentication, port dash control, space auto. All right. So this is actually how you set it up. So this is what I need you to really type in on the switch. So if anybody ever asked you, how do I set up an 802.1x port-based authentication on a switch, this is what you need to do. You go to the switch, AAA new model, set up the server, the radius server in this case, just the way we did it before. Give it a name, the address, the authorization port, the accounting port, the password. And once you exit, then you go and you say AAA authentication DOT1X. DOT1X is saying that I want to use this the 802.1x standard default group radius, which means for all authentication, go to the radius server, and DOT1X system authorized control, and that means block all the data and only allow the 802.1x authentication information to be passed to the server. All right, then you go to the interface, the port that you want, make it port access. That means only data can be going through. And then say, okay, the authentication port control auto. That's the command. That's the command that is going to only allow 802.1x information to go to the server before you are open up the data from one device to the other. All right. Don't forget to type the OTPAE authenticator at the end. All right. So that's how you set up an 802.1x port-based authentication. All right. And that brings us to chapter 3. So we'll have in the in-class and the at-home labs, and hopefully both of these labs will solidify our knowledge on the AAA. Okay. If you have any questions, please don't be shy. Write them down and bring them into class. So until chapter 4, good luck.